Like, I don't know about you, but I am not a big fan of moving. I don't like leaving my old friends. I don't like dealing with the fear of trying to make new friends. But the big thing is, I don't like the actual process of packing up and moving boxes. Here's the thing, like putting things in boxes is tedious work, right? You're trying to make the most of the use of the space that you have in each box, but you don't want to put too many heavy things in any box because then the box will get too heavy and it'll rip, and then you got to carry the box from one place to the other and unload the box, and then you got to carry it again and unpack the whole thing in the new house or the new apartment or whatever. It's exhausting. So if you're anything like me, every time you move, there are usually 1 or 2 boxes that never get unpacked. Right? You just kind of get sick of unpacking and you quit. Or you feel like whatever's in that box is stuff you don't really need right now. Or you don't know where to put the things inside the box, so you just leave them in the box. And I think this is something that we all recognize, but nothing inside that unpacked box can step into the fullness of its purpose while in the box. Another way to say that, a box caps the effectiveness of its contents. That picture frame is unable to display family memories while in a box. Your old baseball glove can't equip you to play catch with your dad while in a box. Your canvases and your paintbrushes can't spark your imagination and creativity while in a box. This isn't something groundbreaking. You already knew this, but when you keep something in a box, you're capping its ability to be present in your life. And as we launch into this new series, I want to suggest that some of us in the room have capped the value that God can have in our lives. Like, God is important to us, no doubt, no doubt. We want him to play a role in our lives. But some of us in the room, maybe more of us than we'd care to admit, have placed God in a box. Right? We have our lives that we want to live. We have our sense of identity that we want to walk in. We have our goals that we want to achieve. We have our relationships that we want to pursue. And then in addition to, but mostly separate from those things, we have the God box. And every so often we'll open up our God box so that God can actually do something in our lives and in our hearts, right? For some of us, we open up the God box once a year at camp. And it's always emotionally powerful, but honestly too infrequent to make much of a difference in our everyday lives. So for others, we open up our God box every week at youth group, but our heart isn't in it, so nothing ever really changes. Some of us only open it up when we're in trouble and we need help. And God comes through for us, but then he goes right back into the box when the crisis is over. Regardless of how often we open up the box or how powerful it is when we do, I think it's important that we admit at the top of this series that many of us have a God box and we like to keep them in there. And of course, the problem is a box caps the effectiveness of its contents, right? You can't experience the fullness of God's presence or the benefit of a strong relationship with him when you keep them tucked away in a box. So maybe the reason that your faith doesn't seem to make as much of a difference in your life as you want it to is because you've put a cap on the effectiveness of God in your life. That's exactly what we're going to be digging into over the next 5 weeks. You want to know where this instinct comes from, right? This instinct to put God in a box. Ooh, I do. Oh, great. Well, basically, tell me. Totally. So this instinct isn't random. Tell me! This instinct to put God in a box, it's not random and it's not new. In fact, it's very old and it was introduced by God himself. The idea of God in a box, right, capping how much of God's presence we have access to in our everyday lives, this idea shows up in a big way in the Old Testament. So in order to help us understand where the idea of boxing God comes from, we're going to read from a letter written by a New Testament author. The author of this letter was writing to a Jewish audience who also had the tendency to keep God in a box. And so the author writes about the origination of the God box in the hopes of helping the audience see why they don't need the God box anymore. We're in Hebrews 9, starting in verse 1. That first covenant between God and Israel had regulations for worship and a place of worship here on earth. There were 2 rooms in that tabernacle. In the first room were a lampstand, a table, and sacred loaves of bread on the table. This room was called the holy place. Did you make this in PowerPoint? This literally looks like a child made it. Yes. Then there was a curtain, and behind the curtain was the second room called the most holy place. In that room were a gold incense altar and a wooden chest called the Ark of the Covenant, which was covered with gold on all sides. Inside the ark were a gold jar containing manna, Aaron's staff that sprouted leaves, and the stone tablets of the covenant. The Ark of the Covenant that the author mentions here was a literal box where the presence of God existed. Now, that's a little confusing because, as you might know, if you've been in church for a while, God's presence is actually everywhere. He is omnipresent, present everywhere. But in the Old Covenant, God wanted to reside with his people, the Israelites, in a way that was tangible and visible for them. So God had the Israelites create this literal box called the Ark of the Covenant, and God's full presence resided inside of that box. And that box resided in the second room of the tabernacle called the most holy place, which was separated from the other room by a curtain. Let's keep going. Verse 5. Above the ark were the cherubim, angel sculptures of divine glory, whose wings stretched out over the ark's cover, the place of atonement. We cannot explain these things in detail now. Now, atonement is a word for payment, and we'll see this in the next set of verses, but essentially, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant is where the high priest would go to sacrifice animals in order to pay for the sins of the people. Verse 6. When these things were all in place, the priests regularly entered the first room as they performed their religious duties, but only the high priest ever entered the most holy place, and only once a year. And he always offered blood for his own sins and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. Only the high priest could step into the most holy place, and even the high priest had to take measures to make sure he was ritualistically pure before entering that space. So you see where the God box comes from, don't you? Tell me! I just told you! In the Old Covenant, God literally placed himself in a box and then separated that box from everyone else with a curtain, and then placed the curtain within a temple. And only one dude could go into that room where God was fully present, and he could only do it once a year. So who could blame you if you're realizing today that you've sort of put God in a box? Like, how can a God who put himself in a box and put a cap on the ability of his people to experience his presence shame you for placing him in a box and capping the amount of his presence that you experience in your everyday life? Don't bother. We'll answer that question next week. You don't want to miss it. But for this week, I want us to stay in this most holy place with the curtain in the God box. Here's the question you might be wondering. If God loves his children and always has, even back in the Old Covenant days, then why didn't he want them to fully experience his presence? Why did God put himself in a box? Probably for the same reason that you shouldn't take a bath with your Pikachu. Look, Pikachu is a super nice little Pokemon thing, right? But it's an electric type Pokemon. By nature, water conducts electricity. That's science. Electricity isn't evil. Pikachu isn't evil, but by the very nature of what comprises them, electricity surges strongly through water and seriously injures or kills anything in its path. That's just the way it is. So should you find yourself ever owning a Pikachu, find a different way to hang out. Bath time should be separate because Pikachu will totally kill you in a bathtub. It's just a result of the nature of water and electricity. So think of water as sin and God as electricity. Because his people were constantly covered in sin, God protected them from his presence. By nature, God and sin cannot coexist in the same place. You cannot be covered in sin and experience the fullness of God's presence. You can't. You'll die. His righteousness, in contrast to your sinfulness, will be so overwhelming for you that you will die. He's just too holy. We know this because it happened in the Old Covenant more than once. People touched the Ark of the Covenant and they died because God is electricity and sin is water. So this isn't something that would have been obvious to us at the beginning of this talk. But I'm hoping that what I'm about to say is obvious now. God put himself in a box to protect his people. He wasn't being snobby. He wasn't playing hard to get. He wasn't making their lives more difficult for his own entertainment. God wanted to be present with his people in a visible, tangible way, while also protecting them from the fullness of his holy presence, because they wouldn't have been able to handle it. And the people of God back in the Old Testament knew that. They knew that they couldn't handle God's full presence. They knew that the gap between them and God was too great. They knew that God was electricity and that they were covered in water. So God put himself in a box, and the unrighteous people of Israel were happy to have it that way. That's because, and this is the point, to the unrighteous, the box is safety. And maybe that's the reason that you like to keep God in a box too. Maybe you keep God in a box because you recognize the vast chasm between your righteousness and his. Maybe you don't feel like letting God out of the box is safe for you. Maybe you envy the Israelites because they got to stand on the sidelines and let the one super religious dude in their group experience the presence of God. Look, I don't know exactly why you see your relationship through the lens of the old covenant, but I know that a lot of you in the room do. And while we now understand where that instinct to keep God in a box comes from, a lot has changed since the days of the tabernacle and the curtain in the most holy place. And understanding this aspect of the gospel narrative is going to be so unbelievably important for us if we're ever going to stop capping God's presence in our lives and experience the fullness of what our relationship with him could be. It was God himself who chose to go inside the box. But as we're going to discover next week, it was God himself who made a way to break out of it. We'll see you later. Pikachu! Oh, man. Why am I so weird?